What's up YouTube? Today we're looking at how to create these dope wireframes in Blender. We're going to start with a solid 3D model in Blender, and then from there we're going to use the wireframe modifier and some other things, tweak it a little bit, add some colors, and get these wireframe models, then take them into Illustrator and put dimensions on them. So let's get started. This is a space that I'm designing for this competition thing that we do at my high school. But anyways, as you saw earlier, it was primarily solid. Then I go to that little wrench icon in the right hand side, and that's the modifier icon. So you want to add wireframe modifiers, and you can choose your thickness based off how thick you want your lines to appear. One thing to note that I was messing with a little bit in this clip is you want to turn your subdivision surface, if you have a modifier, subdivision surface modifier, which essentially just increases geometry, increases the smoothness. You want to turn that down a little bit for this step, simply because if it's too high, you just get the kind of solid. It's very difficult to differentiate the individual wires. So go ahead and I'm just turning these down to 3, but depending on your project, you want to change that number a little bit. The next step is to go through and add, what I'm choosing to do is adding diffuse color shader, and this serves if you're having wires, you don't necessarily want to make them like look realistic material, just have a color that represents what they are. So in this case, I'm going through, I'm making all my like little residential toruses blue, and then the industrial ones red, stuff like that, making it all diffuse just to keep it from getting glary and keeping it as simple as possible. Alright, so this is looking pretty good. We have the different colors that represent the different parts of the design. I misspoke earlier. The green is the residential. The blue are the rings that hold against the inertial force of these pressurized containers. So that looks pretty good. I'm going to go in here now and make a couple slight changes, especially to the interior that you can't usually see when you're rendering in a solid frame, or just when you're rendering a solid object with walls that you can't see through. You can't really see the center bit, but with this wireframe you can. So I'm adding an element into this design that I want the wireframe to be able to show that you wouldn't otherwise be able to see with just a solid render, and that's just like the center tube. One thing that I would note is it kind of helps to actually add cuts within this ring, or loops of points and lines, which makes it show up a little bit more with the wireframe render. Alright, so here we have kind of our finalized wire render, and you don't have to go too high on the samples. The render shouldn't take that long simply because there's not a lot of reflection, which is really what uses up a lot of computer processing power. So once you have that wireframe rendered out, if you have Illustrator, take it into Illustrator. Photoshop works fine as well, but I'm going to be using Illustrator. So with Illustrator, remember to place it. You can change the size so it occupies a good portion of that space. And then go over to the little pen tool and click on that. You can adjust the stroke so that it looks, so that there's arrows on both sides as I'm doing this shot. And then once you're there, I made it 2-point. You can mess with it. You can choose the exact arrow types you want by clicking on stroke and then choosing the arrow types for both sides. What I'm doing, I'm just referencing the number of meters I want on both. In this frame, I'm actually going back to my initial Blender render, and now I'm rendering out the side image. So that's something that I should touch on as well. The camera I'm using in this is the orthographic mode, which essentially just means that it looks more like it would just on a drawing table without any sort of perspective. Like, it doesn't consider like the warp that a lens would affect if you were actually rendering this out for real. So that's definitely a good thing to do with wireframes, orthographic rendering mode. This is the side image, so I'm rendering that out. Go back to the top-down shot while that renders and start adding in arrows for the dimensions. One really helpful thing is you can just hold down Alt to copy something in Illustrator. That might be different if you're using different software, but just Alt and then slide it over, then rotating it so it goes along the arrows. One thing that I have found helpful is to make the text bigger than you think you need to, because in that case, if this image is shrunk down to a smaller factor, a smaller size, people can still read it. So as you can see on that side, I kind of got that circular arrow. You can do that with the pen tool just by clicking, and then on the second point that you click on, go ahead and hold down and drag out, and there'll be like this little bar that will expand that will allow you to make that curve. So just adding in dimensions right now. This is pretty standard stuff, but yeah, definitely as you can see, I'm pulling up the calculator and making sure all my dimensions work out right. That's something that I would highly suggest. So now I'm placing the side image in. In case you didn't catch that, I created another artboard, and that's sometimes better having 2 artboards in one file rather than creating a new InDesign file, just for simplicity's sakes, and then when you render it out, it's a little bit easier to deal with as well. So I'm trying to remember what dimension I'm using here. 700 meters it is, and once again, just using that Alt to copy over those arrows. and going through and making the arrowheads what I want them to be. One thing that helps is if you click on the arrow type that you currently want, then click on the pen tool and create a new arrow, it'll automatically match the form of the arrow that you were just clicking on. So now, as you can see, this little tube thing that I'm adding dimensions to, that's what I added in earlier. That's what I was talking to you about. So that's in there. That looks nice. One also thing that you can do to add to blueprints is add like little comments in lines, which helps, especially if you're using this as a kind of a means of presentation, to help you remind your audience like what exactly they should be looking at and what each of these things means. Alright, so as we finish up here, just one final comment. When I moved the images over from Blender to Illustrator, actually substantially, well not substantially, I decreased the opacity to about 70%, and that made the text and the measurements stick out a little bit more, and that's helpful just to make the audience really focus in on the things that you want them to look at, which are the dimensions, and using the wireframe as kind of a background, which I think is helpful in like a blueprint situation. So I hope you guys enjoyed that tutorial. I certainly enjoyed making these. Feel free to leave any comments or suggestions in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer them. So have a good day, YouTube. Bye.